Welcome to the deep dive. We're absolutely thrilled to have you with us today.
Really excited for this one.
Yeah, it's going to be a big one. Real quick, if you are joining us for the very first time, or if you've been a long-time listener who regularly joins our explorations, please take a quick second right now to like and subscribe to the deep dive.
It really is the best way to ensure you never miss out on the materials we unpack together here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And today we are reviewing a highly provocative, deeply controversial, and honestly incredibly dense new ebook. It's titled Accountability Gap: Why Women Aren't Held to the Same Standards.
Written by Conrad Riker, copyright 2025.
Right. And you can find this book right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. If today's analysis piques your curiosity, we highly recommend you follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack to see how his arguments are evolving in real time.
Because it is undeniably a text that is generating a massive amount of cultural shockwaves right now. I mean, the scope of Riker's claims is incredibly broad.
Yeah, he's not just looking at one isolated issue.
No, not at all. He is attempting to map out a grand, unified theory of modern gender dynamics. He touches on almost every single facet of modern life, from evolutionary biology to family courts, corporate boardrooms, and even modern dating apps.
And that sheer scope is exactly why we are dedicating our time to it today. The core mission of our deep dive is to unpack this extensive architecture. We're going to look at his arguments regarding institutional capture and the intense societal pressures that he argues are currently uniquely crushing men.
And this is vital. Before we take a single step further, we need to issue a crucial foundational impartiality disclaimer.
Yes, thank you. We are setting the ground rules for you, the listener, right up front, because this is highly politically charged material.
It absolutely is.
We want to state explicitly and unequivocally that we are not endorsing these viewpoints. We are not taking sides, and we are not advocating for the author's perspective.
Right.
Our goal today is strictly to objectively examine, report on, and understand the arguments and ideas exactly as they are presented in the original source material.
We are essentially putting this book under a microscope to see how the arguments are built, which is really the most valuable way to approach a text like this. We are acting as your guides through a very dense, often highly volatile landscape.
Yeah.
By meticulously analyzing this text, we gain a fascinating, unfiltered lens into the modern men's rights movement and the specific ideological countercurrents pushing back hard against mainstream progressive narratives.
Whether you find yourself agreeing with the author's fundamental premises or vehemently disagreeing with every word he writes, understanding the actual architecture of these arguments is crucial. It's way more useful than just engaging with the social media caricature of them.
Absolutely. It helps you understand the broader cultural conversation happening in the world right now.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the place Riker chooses to start is actually really surprising.
Yeah, it catches you off guard.
Right. If you pick up a book about modern double standards and cultural accountability, you might expect chapter 1 to start with a trending hashtag or a recent political scandal. But he bypasses modern politics entirely.
He goes straight to biology.
He anchors his entire thesis in biology. He starts with what he calls the biological imperative and the quote-unquote myth of gender equality.
It's a very strategic rhetorical opening. What's fascinating here is that he wants to establish a foundation that feels immutable.
Because culture is debatable.
Exactly. Culture changes. But if he can convince the reader that his arguments are based on natural law, then everything that follows carries the weight of scientific inevitability. To build this biological baseline, he brings up a deeply tragic, historically significant case from the 1960s.
The story of David Reimer.
Yes.
For those of you listening who might not be familiar with medical history, the David Reimer case is one of the most infamous psychological experiments of the 20th century.
It's a tough read.
It really is. David was born a biological male, but due to a botched circumcision in infancy that caused severe damage, his parents were advised by a very prominent psychologist, Dr. John Money at Johns Hopkins, to simply raise him as a girl.
The prevailing theory Dr. Money was pushing at the time was that gender was entirely a social construct.
The blank slate.
Right. The belief was that if you took a biological male infant, gave him female hormones, dressed him in pink, gave him dolls, and socialized him completely as a female named Brenda, he would seamlessly adopt a female gender identity. It was the ultimate test of nurture over nature.
But Riker highlights this case because the nurture approach failed spectacularly.
Right.
And tragically.
But it failed completely.
Despite this total, all-encompassing environmental conditioning from the time he was a literal baby, David instinctively gravitated toward rough and tumble play. He rejected the dresses, and he suffered immense, agonizing psychological trauma. He never felt like a girl.
Never.
Eventually, when he was a teenager and learned the truth, he immediately transitioned back to living as a male.
And tragically, the compounding trauma of his life ultimately led to his suicide as an adult.
It's all.
Riker doesn't just mention this in passing, though. He uses the Reimer case as a foundational proof point, a battering ram against postmodern feminist theories of gender fluidity.
He argues that if a child can be subjected to the most intense, deliberate, gender-neutral, or cross-gender socialization imaginable, and still instinctively default to their biological hardwiring.
Then gender cannot possibly be a mere social construct.
Right.
Riker asserts it is deeply, irreversibly hardwired into our DNA.
So he's saying essentially that modern progressive ideology is trying to force a John Money-style socialization on the entire culture, and it's destined to cause the same kind of psychological trauma on a macro scale.
That is precisely the parallel he is drawing. And he doesn't stop with human psychology. He zooms out to evolutionary psychology, pulling examples from the animal kingdom to reinforce this idea that natural roles are an evolutionary feature, not a bug.
And this is where I want to pause and push back on his logic for a second, because he jumps from the very human, very specific tragedy of David Reimer straight to lions and penguins.
Yeah, it's quite the pivot.
How exactly does he connect an African predator or an Antarctic bird to modern societal expectations without losing the reader entirely?
It is a leap, but he executes it by focusing on survival mechanics. He talks about the clear, undeniable gender dynamics in a lion pride,
Where the females do the hunting.
where the females do the majority of the hunting and the massive males act as the violent territorial protectors. His point is that these roles aren't the result of a lion patriarchy enforcing oppressive norms. They are strictly divided by sex because that specific division of labor ensured the survival of the species over millions of years.
But the penguin example is the one that really caught my eye. Because male penguins in the Antarctic are famous for standing in the freezing cold, sharing the load of incubating the eggs while the females go hunt. That doesn't exactly scream traditional male dominance.
And that is exactly why he uses it.
Oh, really?
Yes, he is anticipating the critique that he just wants men to rule everything. By using the penguin, he's arguing that deep, intensive male parental investment is a biological reality designed for the survival of offspring.
Ah, I see.
He isn't arguing for male tyranny. He's arguing for biological utility. He uses the penguin to assert that when modern society sidelines fathers, whether that's through heavily biased family court divorce laws or cultural narratives that paint fathers as secondary parents, society is actively denying basic evolutionary biology.
Okay. So, by establishing this biological baseline, whether it's through the Reimer tragedy or evolutionary animal behaviors, Riker frames the societal differences we see between men and women today not as the result of systemic patriarchal oppression, but as natural, inevitable outcomes. He's saying, look at nature, we're supposed to be different.
Exactly. And once he feels he has successfully laid that concrete foundation of biological difference, he executes a very sharp pivot directly into economics.
The wage gap.
The wage gap. Because if you accept his premise that men and women are biologically driven to possess different behavioral traits and make different life choices, then it logically follows that we should expect to see different economic outcomes.
Which brings us squarely to that famous 77 cents on the dollar statistic. If you were listening to this on your commute or at your desk, you have almost certainly sat through a corporate seminar or watched a news segment citing the statistic that women make roughly 77 cents for every dollar a man makes.
It is one of the most repeated data points in modern cultural discourse.
So how does Riker handle it?
He takes direct, unflinching aim at it. He doesn't just disagree with it, he calls it a deliberate, gross oversimplification designed to manufacture outrage.
How does he dismantle the math? Because 77 cents is a hard number.
He argues that the 77-cent figure is an aggregate. It just takes the average earnings of all working women and compares it to the average earnings of all working men without controlling for the choices those individuals actually make.
So it ignores variables.
Massive variables. Riker's argument relies on the premise that when economists account for crucial factors like the total number of hours worked per week, the danger or physical toll of the specific career choices made, the willingness to relocate for a promotion, and the level of continuous, uninterrupted experience in a field, the gap shrinks dramatically.
He leans heavily on the work of Harvard economist Claudia Goldin here, right? She actually won a Nobel Prize for her work on women's labor market outcomes.
Yes. Golden's research found that the persistent wage gap is largely not about paying a woman less to do the exact same job as a man sitting next to her. Instead, it is largely a result of what economists call the motherhood penalty.
The time off.
Right. Women who choose to have children and take significant time off to care for them end up earning less over their total lifetimes than their male counterparts who never stopped working.
But mainstream corporate narratives usually frame the motherhood penalty as a profound systemic failure. They argue society doesn't support mothers enough with childcare or leave, hence the penalty. Riker frames this entirely differently, doesn't he?
He flips it completely. He doesn't see the motherhood penalty as a symptom of systemic sexism or institutional discrimination. He frames it as the natural consequence of biological reality intersecting with personal choice.
His logic is pretty unapologetic.
Very. He states simply that men do not biologically bear children. They cannot abstractly give birth. Therefore, their career trajectories remain uninterrupted.
So he's arguing that you cannot demand equal economic outcomes if you are making fundamentally different biological and lifestyle choices.
Precisely. He argues that attempting to force equal economic outcomes through legislation or corporate mandates ignores the fundamental reality of biological differences and the inherent trade-offs that come with them.
It's an interesting thought experiment.
It is. If a man works 60 hours a week in a dangerous, high-stress field, and a woman works 40 hours a week in a safer, more flexible field so she can be present for her children, Riker argues it is actually profoundly unjust to demand they earn the exact same lifetime wealth.
And he extends this critique to the concept of the glass ceiling. The book argues that there is no invisible systemic barrier maintained by a patriarchy holding women back from top executive positions. Instead, he introduces the phrase glass escalator.
Right. He claims it is a glass escalator that is simply slowed down by the caregiving choices women naturally and often willingly make.
Stepping off the escalator.
Exactly. He argues that women are ascending rapidly, but they frequently choose to step off the escalator for several years to raise children. When they step back on, they are naturally behind the men who stayed on the escalator the entire time.
Riker doesn't stop at the wage gap, though. He goes right for the throat of modern corporate HR departments by attacking affirmative action and diversity quotas. He uses the research of the famous economist Thomas Sowell here.
Yes, Sowell has argued for decades that affirmative action policies, globally and historically, rarely help the truly marginalized at the bottom of society.
They help the people already doing well.
Right. Sowell's data suggests they almost exclusively benefit the already privileged, affluent members of a minority group. Meanwhile, they actively punish working-class people who are passed over simply because they happen to belong to the majority demographic.
So how does Riker apply Sowell's racial and economic framework directly to gender dynamics in 2025?
He argues that modern corporate diversity mandates, which often explicitly state goals to hire or promote more women into leadership, are sacrificing true meritocracy on the altar of political correctness. He views this as a systemic, institutionalized injustice against men.
Because men are being passed over.
In Riker's view, you have men who are working longer hours, taking on more demanding and perilous roles, only to be passed over for a promotion simply to fulfill an HR gender quota.
Let's pause on that for a second. Think about the implications of what Riker is saying here, especially if you work in a corporate environment. How does this purely biological, choice-driven framing challenge the mainstream narratives you encounter every day?
It's a stark, jarring contrast.
Yeah, it really is. Riker is essentially arguing that you cannot legislate away human nature. He believes that when institutions try to force equity of outcome by ignoring biological behavioral differences, they don't achieve justice. They just manufacture massive, simmering resentment among the men who feel penalized for their own competence.
Which perfectly transitions us into the absolute core thesis of the book. This is the bedrock of his entire argument, the titular concept itself. The accountability gap.
Right, the title of the book.
Having spent the first part of the book arguing that men and women are fundamentally different biologically and behaviorally, he then claims that modern society has constructed a highly artificial, wildly hypocritical double standard in how it judges those behaviors.
This is where we get into the meat of his cultural critique. The book defines this accountability gap as a pervasive societal condition where men are held hyper-accountable. If a man makes a mistake, exhibits a flaw, or steps out of line, he is destroyed.
But women, Riker argues, are consistently shielded from scrutiny. He claims they are infantilized by the media and given a free pass for terrible behavior.
To illustrate this hyper-accountability for men, he looks at the Me Too movement as his primary case study. Now, it's important to note he acknowledges that Me Too started with a valid premise, right? Exposing genuine, horrific workplace harassment and assault by powerful men.
Right, the Harvey Weinsteins of the world.
Exactly.
But Riker argues that the movement rapidly devolved from a necessary exposure of predators into a cultural witch hunt. He claims that during the height of Me Too, the fundamental legal principle of innocent until proven guilty was completely inverted.
Men were presumed guilty immediately.
Presumed guilty in the court of public opinion the very second an accusation was tweeted out. Due process was entirely bypassed, and careers were permanently erased based on mere allegations long before any evidence was ever presented in a courtroom.
And it is in this environment of alleged male hyper-accountability that Riker introduces his most controversial term, toxic femininity. Now, obviously, toxic masculinity is a phrase we hear constantly. It refers to the societal pressures on men to be violent, dominant, or emotionally repressed. Riker takes that exact linguistic structure and flips it to force the reader to consider female behavior. How exactly does he define toxic femininity in practice?
He defines it primarily through psychological and relational abuse. Riker argues that toxic femininity manifests as manipulative behavior, emotional blackmail, systemic gaslighting, and most crucially, the weaponization of victimhood.
The weaponization of victimhood.
He argues that because society is deeply conditioned to view women as inherent victims and men as inherent aggressors, women can weaponize that bias to destroy men with near total impunity.
And to anchor this concept in the real world, he uses a massive, unavoidable cultural event, the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp trial.
That case is absolutely central to his argument because it played out so publicly on a global stage over several years.
Walk us through how he breaks down that timeline, because it really illustrates the gap he's talking about.
The text outlines how, initially, when Amber Heard made her accusations of domestic violence and wrote her op-ed, the media, Hollywood, and society at large believed her immediately and without question.
Right.
The immediate result was that Johnny Depp's career was virtually destroyed overnight. He was dropped from major franchises and labeled a wife-beater in international headlines. That is the hyper-accountability of men that Riker is talking about, immediate destruction based on an accusation.
But then the trial happens.
Right. Years later, when they actually went to trial and audio recordings and physical evidence emerged that pointed heavily to Heard being the primary aggressor, admitting to hitting him, mocking him, for thinking anyone would believe a man could be a victim of domestic violence, the dynamic shifted.
But Riker notes the media was reluctant to shift with it.
Extremely reluctant. Riker notes that while the jury ultimately sided largely with Depp, the mainstream media establishment was painfully slow to correct their initial narrative.
He argues they tried to frame it as mutual abuse rather than admit a woman could be a primary vicious abuser.
Exactly. Riker uses this highly visible case to illustrate that society is deeply, almost pathologically conditioned to blindly believe women as innocent victims and to immediately condemn men as violent abusers, even when physical evidence points to the contrary.
But he doesn't just rely on celebrity trials. He brings up a very chilling, obscure 2018 criminal case from Florida to prove this double standard exists for everyday people.
Yes, the Florida case is a stark example. According to the text, a woman was arrested for stabbing her boyfriend. And the reason she stabbed him, he refused to have sex with her.
Let's pause on that. She stabbed a man for denying her sex.
Yes. Riker points out that the mainstream media coverage of this horrific event was incredibly minimal. It was a local news curiosity. There was no national outrage. There were no think pieces in major publications about female entitlement to male bodies.
And Riker asks the reader to run a thought experiment here. Imagine the exact reverse scenario. Imagine a man stabbing his girlfriend because she refused to sleep with him.
The media response would be deafening. It would be front-page national news for weeks. It would spark thousands of hours of cable news debates and national conversations about the lethal threat of toxic masculinity and male entitlement.
It would be inescapable.
Riker argues that the silence surrounding the female perpetrator in Florida is definitive proof of the accountability gap. When a woman commits an atrocity, society looks for excuses or ignores it. When a man does it, it is an indictment of his entire gender.
To back up this concept of toxic femininity with actual scientific data, the text cites a 2017 study published in the peer-reviewed journal Aggressive Behavior. Because people might say, well, men commit more violent crime. How does Riker address that?
He acknowledges that men commit more direct physical violence, but he uses the aggressive behavior study to show that women are actually just as aggressive as men. Their aggression just manifests in a fundamentally different way.
And so?
Instead of a punch to the face, Female aggression is frequently indirect and relational. It involves spreading vicious rumors, orchestrating social exclusion, destroying a target's reputation behind their back, and psychological manipulation.
Covert warfare.
It is covert warfare. Yet, as Riker points out, despite the devastating psychological toll this relational aggression takes on its victims, often driving victims to severe depression or suicide, there are no national public health campaigns or media dialogues addressing this specific, pervasive type of female aggression.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me, and where Riker's rhetorical strategy is actually quite brilliant. He claims that by constantly making excuses for women, by brushing off their bad behavior, their relational aggression, or even their physical violence as just being hormonal or emotional or the result of some past trauma society, is actually profoundly infantilizing women.
It is a fascinating rhetorical flip. He is using the progressive language of empowerment to argue for conservative, strict accountability.
Exactly. He is saying to the progressive establishment, you claim you want women to be treated as equals, but by treating them as these fragile, delicate creatures who can do no wrong and can never be held responsible for their own toxic actions, you are paradoxically stripping them of their agency.
Because they aren't adults.
Right. If you cannot be held fully accountable for your bad actions, if you are always given an excuse, you aren't truly being treated as an equal, capable, autonomous adult. You are being treated like a child.
That is the core philosophical thrust of the book. But Riker knows that high-level cultural theory only goes so far. He brings this entire concept of the accountability gap right down to the microscopic interpersonal level. He specifically examines how this double standard poisons modern relationships and dating.
He applies this gap directly to romance, and the statistics he pulls here are quite striking. He wants to show that the demand for equality is highly selective. He cites recent Pew research showing that 57% of women still expect men to pay for dates. Meanwhile, only 4% of men expect women to pay.
Riker uses that specific data point to highlight what he sees as rampant systemic hypocrisy. He argues that modern women are demanding absolute, unyielding equality in the corporate boardroom and in political representation, but simultaneously demanding a return to highly traditional chivalry and male financial provision the moment the dinner check arrives.
He's saying they want the privileges of traditionalism without any of the responsibilities, while men are expected to bear the responsibilities of traditionalism without any of the historical authority.
Precisely. And the data gets even more skewed when Riker turns his attention to online dating, which is how a massive percentage of modern relationships begin. The text cites widely circulated data from the University of Michigan analyzing user behavior on dating apps.
This data is wild.
The data shows that women, on average, swipe right, meaning they like or show interest, in only 14% of the men they see on the app.
Wait, let me stop you there. So on these platforms, 86% of men are essentially invisible to the average woman. They're completely swiped away into the void.
According to the data he cites, yes, women are fiercely hyper-selective. By contrast, the data shows men swipe right on roughly 46% of women.
So what are the psychological and economic implications Riker draws from this massive disparity in selectivity?
He interprets this data to mean that the modern dating landscape is not a romantic partnership. It is a hyper-competitive, deeply skewed marketplace where women hold almost entirely disproportionate power.
Because they have options.
Because they have access to thousands of men via an app, they can demand near perfection in looks, status, and financial provision. Men, meanwhile, are left scrambling to prove their worth, forced to compete intensely for the attention of the top 14% of women in an environment where men are heavily scrutinized and easily discarded with a swipe of the thumb.
And he ties this dating app dynamic directly to mental health and financial stress. He includes a University of Pennsylvania study showing that 72% of men today feel intense, crushing pressure to provide financially for their partners. Compare that to only 28% of women who feel that same financial pressure.
Riker argues this proves that despite decades of feminist theory declaring financial independence for women, the core biological expectation that a man must be a provider to be worthy of love hasn't disappeared. It is actually intensified.
It's worse than before.
Men are drowning under the pressure to provide in an economy that makes it harder than ever to do so, while being told by the culture that their desire to be a provider is somehow toxic.
It is a brutal double bind. And he is incredibly blunt about the ultimate endpoint of these relationships, too. If you manage to survive the dating app gauntlet and actually get married, Riker argues the accountability gap follows you right into the courthouse. He calls modern divorce a financial death sentence for men.
The statistics he marshals here are designed to paint a picture of a legal system that is deeply hostile to men. According to his sources, women initiate roughly 70% of all divorces in the United States, and the financial outcomes are wildly divergent.
Tell us about the drop in living standards.
Following a divorce, a man's standard of living drops by an average of 21%. He is often paying alimony, child support, and funding two households on one income.
And what happens to the woman's standard of living, according to Riker's data?
His data suggests a woman's standard of living actually increases by 10% post-divorce. But the financial ruin isn't even the core of his argument. The true devastation, Riker argues, happens in family courts regarding children. He notes that mothers are awarded sole or primary custody of children, a staggering 82% of the time.
82%. That is an overwhelming monopoly on parental access.
It is. And if we connect this specific data point to the broader social fabric, the implications Riker is drawing are profound. He asks the reader to look at the world through the eyes of a young man today. If men believe the legal and social systems surrounding marriage are fundamentally rigged against them, if they view marriage as what the author provocatively calls the marriage plantation.
That is an intensely loaded term, marriage plantation.
It is meant to be shocking. He uses it to describe a system where a man labors for decades to build a family and amass resources, only to realize he can lose access to his own children and have his wealth illegally extracted from him at a judge's discretion, simply because his wife initiated a divorce. Riker asks, what is the logical outcome of a system structured like this?
If the game is rigged, people stop playing.
Exactly. Riker suggests this perceived systemic hostility leads directly to the macro trends we are seeing globally: plummeting, below replacement birth rates, a terrifying rise in male social isolation and loneliness, and an entire generation of young men who are choosing to opt out of romantic relationships, marriage, and family formation altogether because the risk-to-reward ratio is utterly broken.
That is a bleak, dystopian picture of modern love, but it perfectly sets the stage for Section 3 of our deep dive. Because Riker argues that this accountability gap, this rigged system, didn't just happen by accident. It wasn't an organic cultural shift. He claims it is the direct result of what he calls institutional capture.
Institutional capture.
He argues that the major pillars of our society, specifically academia, the media, and the political apparatus, have been completely hijacked by a gynocracy fueled by progressive feminist ideologies.
We need to define gynocracy as he uses it. The term technically refers to a society governed physically by women. But in Riker's context, he means a society governed by a system of rules, norms, and HR policies that exclusively prioritize female comfort, female safety, and female interests, often at the direct expense of male flourishing.
And he begins his autopsy of this capture with the university system. He looks at academia, the place where ideas are forged.
Right. He points to a very revealing 2019 report regarding the University of Toronto's gender studies program. This report analyzed the syllabi and revealed that over 80% of its course content was focused entirely on feminist victimhood narratives.
80%.
It taught students that history is solely a story of male oppressors and female victims, with absolutely no room for dissenting perspectives, biological realities, or the celebration of male historical achievements.
He argues that these departments have ceased to be places of education. They are factories of ideological indoctrination, and he points to the hiring practices within these universities to back up how deep the rot goes. An investigation cited in the book found that 75% of tenure-track positions in gender studies and related humanities fields were filled by candidates who openly identified as feminist activists.
He argues that the concept of tenure, which was originally designed to protect controversial free speech and rigorous, unpopular academic inquiry, has been completely inverted. Tenure has been weaponized as a permanent shield for ideological conformity. Once an activist gets tenure, they only hire other activists, creating an impenetrable echo chamber.
He provides a striking, almost unbelievable anecdotal example of this in action regarding a Harvard professor.
Yes, he details an incident involving a Harvard professor who teaches a prominent course on feminist theory. According to the text, a student was allegedly failed by this professor on a major paper. And the reason for the failure wasn't poor grammar or lack of research.
What was it?
The students simply argued that the Industrial Revolution, which was largely driven by male inventors, engineers, and laborers, ultimately improved living standards, life expectancy, and economic freedom for both men and women, which is a fairly standard, historically supported economic argument.
But the professor reportedly dismissed the argument entirely, labeling it as reactionary and anti-feminist, and failed the student. For Riker, this single anecdote represents the death of intellectual freedom on the modern campus. It is the enforcement of a rigid anti-male dogma where acknowledging any positive male contribution to history is a punishable academic offense.
And from the college campus, he argues this ideology graduates and moves straight into the media landscape, which he views as entirely complicit in this capture. He points to Hollywood and the erasure of complex male characters. He specifically targets the trend of reboots, citing films like Ghostbusters and Ocean's 8. His critique of media isn't just that they made movies with women. His critique is how they did it. He claims that in these reboots, the original male characters are either erased entirely, or any men who appear in the films are reduced to one-dimensional bumbling idiots or malicious villains solely to prop up the competence of the female leads. He argues Hollywood is incapable of portraying strong women without simultaneously tearing down men.
But the movies are just the cultural background noise. He argues the media's real devastating weapon is the coordinated vilification of actual real-world men.
We touched on this briefly with the Me Too discussion and Amber Heard, but he expands on it significantly here. He cites the media frenzies surrounding figures like Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh during his confirmation hearings and the comedian Aziz Ansari.
The Ansari case was a major turning point in the cultural conversation, wasn't it?
It was. Ansari was essentially subjected to a massive media cancellation campaign over what amounted to a bad, awkward date, not a crime. Riker argues that the media's eager, breathless willingness to destroy these male lives based on unproven allegations or mere awkwardness demonstrated a systemic bias.
That chilling effect.
It created a terrifying chilling effect across society where everyday men realized they were one accusation or one bad date away from total social and professional ruin. They became terrified to speak up, mentor women in the workplace, or defend themselves for fear of a public backlash.
Then Riker takes this concept of capture to the absolute highest levels of power, national politics. How does the gynocracy operate in Washington?
He cites a fascinating 2023 Harvard study analyzing political media coverage. The study showed that while women made up roughly 23% of Congress at the time, they received a massive, disproportionate 78% of the media coverage.
So the media is intensely fixated on female politicians.
Yes. Riker views this as the media apparatus artificially inflating the importance and visibility of female politicians while systematically sidelining and ignoring their male counterparts.
He uses the 2020 U.S. presidential race as his prime example of this dynamic in action, specifically the selection of the vice president.
He argues that Joe Biden, despite winning the primary, was immediately pressured by this captured gynocratic media system to publicly commit to limiting his vice presidential search exclusively to a female running mate.
Limiting the pool entirely.
Riker argues that by doing this, Biden ultimately picked Kamala Harris based primarily on demographic checkboxes, gender, and race, rather than pure political merit or voter popularity. Meanwhile, heavily experienced, highly popular male politicians like Bernie Sanders were shoved to the sidelines and dismissed by the media establishment simply as old white men whose time had passed.
He also points to a very specific, highly visual moment in politics to prove the double standard. The media's reaction to former Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi tearing up President Trump's State of the Union speech on live national television.
Riker notes that the mainstream media almost universally praised Pelosi for that action. They called her powerful, bold, and a master strategist for ripping up the document behind the president's back.
And again, he asks for the role reversal thought experiment.
Right. He argues that if a male politician, let's say a Republican speaker, had stood behind a female Democratic president and engaged in the exact same destructive, highly theatrical, visually aggressive behavior, the media coverage would have been entirely different.
He would have been crucified.
That man would have been universally condemned as unhinged, dangerous, violently aggressive, and lacking the emotional control required for high office. But for Pelosi, it was empowering.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, what Riker is doing is outlining a series of massive interlocking mechanisms. He doesn't view these as isolated incidents. He views tenured radical professors writing the theory, a biased media narrative disseminating the theory, and gender-focused political policies enforcing the theory as a single, unified system. A system designed to enforce female supremacy and relentlessly marginalize male excellence.
And he points to actual legislation to prove this isn't just a conspiracy theory. He cites the Biden administration's push for the Equality Act. And over in Europe, The UK's implementation of mandatory gender pay gap reporting for corporations as legislative proof that this ideology has fully captured the levers of state power.
But he argues there is a massive, tangible economic and societal cost to this ideological capture. It's not just academic debate. It is causing real-world chaos. He points to the massive cultural and financial backlash Target faced after implementing controversial gender-neutral bathroom policies.
He also cites a very disturbing 2022 report from the Canadian Safe Schools Network. The report revealed that after schools forcefully implemented sweeping gender-neutral spaces and policies in the name of progressive inclusion, the result wasn't harmony.
It was chaos.
Instead, incidents of sexual harassment, bullying, and severe discomfort skyrocketed. Girls reported feeling deeply unsafe in previously private spaces, and boys reported feeling unfairly targeted and constantly monitored as inherent predators. The policy, driven by ideology, created chaos in reality.
And on the purely economic front, he looks at the cost of the university capture we discussed earlier. He notes that billions of dollars in federal student loans and taxpayer money are funneled every year into sprawling gender studies and diversity programs. Yet, graduates from those specific programs earn, on average, 20% less over their lifetimes than their peers who chose rigorous STEM fields like engineering or computer science.
Riker frames this as a catastrophic, systemic misallocation of resources. We are plunging a generation into massive debt to teach them grievance and victimhood, driven entirely by political ideology, rather than equipping them with the practical, hard skills that align with economic reality and actual market demand.
Okay, Riker has built the biological case, the economic case, and the institutional case. Now we are moving into the section of the book where he examines the human toll. How does this alleged multi-front war on men actually impact the spiritual, legal, and physical well-being of the average man on the street? Let's start with religion, which is a really fascinating and unexpected angle for a book like this.
It is a profound angle. Riker looks at how feminism has intersected with theology. He specifically focuses on the 1976 decision by the Episcopal Church to officially ordain female priests and fully integrate progressive gender ideology into their doctrine.
What was the result of that shift, according to Riker?
Following that decision and the subsequent decades of theological shifts, the Episcopal Church saw a catastrophic 50% drop in their overall membership. For Riker, this is not a coincidence or a result of general secularization. He argues that the deliberate feminization of religious institutions literally hollows them out from the inside.
How so? Why would a female priest drive men away?
He claims that when you replace traditional authoritative male leadership with a softer, progressive, feminist theology that often demonizes traditional masculinity as sinful or toxic, men simply disengage. They quietly walk out the back door. They lose a vital historical source of moral guidance, brotherhood, and community because the institution no longer speaks to their innate psychological needs or respects their natural inclinations toward hierarchy and stoic duty.
He contrasts the steep decline of the Episcopal Church with the trajectories of the Catholic, Mormon, and Islamic faiths.
Yes, he notes that these specific religions, which, despite intense modern cultural pressure, have steadfastly maintained strict traditional male leadership structures, are depicted not just as surviving, but as thriving, muscular bulwarks against feminist cultural encroachment.
He points to the Mormon Church, right?
Yes, he highlights the Mormon Church's intense doctrinal emphasis on fathers actively, authoritatively leading their families in faith. He also points to Islamic traditions where imams serve as strong, unquestioned community leaders. Riker argues these models actually work and retain male engagement precisely because they recognize and honor the unique psychological and spiritual needs of men rather than trying to reprogram them.
Moving from the spiritual courts to the secular courts, Riker mounts a severe, data-heavy critique of the legal system, specifically focusing on what researchers call the gender sentencing gap.
If the wage gap is the famous feminist statistic, the sentencing gap is Riker's counter statistic. He cites a highly detailed 2021 study by the University of Michigan, which analyzed media and legal language. The study found that news stories and court documents regarding male defendants are 40% more likely to use overtly dehumanizing, monstrous language than stories about female defendants who committed the exact same crimes.
So the media paints the male criminal as a monster and the female criminal as a troubled victim of circumstance. And Riker argues this media bias doesn't stop at the courthouse steps. It seeps directly into the courtroom, infecting the minds of judges and swaying juries.
Absolutely. The data he points to suggests that men receive significantly longer prison sentences than women for the exact same offenses and are far more likely to be incarcerated rather than given probation. To put a human face on this systemic legal bias, Riker brings up the harrowing, infuriating story of Brian Banks.
I remember this story. It is a terrifying nightmare scenario. Brian Banks was a highly recruited high school football star in California. He had a massive, bright future ahead of him, full scholarship offers on the table, and then he was falsely accused of rape by a female classmate.
Based solely on that uncorroborated accusation, facing a legal system and a media environment that heavily presumed his guilt because he was a large, strong male, Banks was advised to take a plea deal rather than risk decades in prison. He spent 5 brutal years in maximum security prison, another 5 years on strict parole as a registered sex offender, his entire life and dreams completely derailed.
And then what happened?
Years later, his accuser secretly reached out to him and was caught on tape, freely admitting that she had completely fabricated the entire story. Banks was finally officially exonerated. But Riker uses this devastating story to highlight the terrifying razor-edge reality men face in the legal system that he argues is utterly captured by a gynocentric bias.
A system that presumes men are guilty predators and punishes them far more harshly.
Exactly, while often allowing false accusers to face zero legal consequences for destroying a man's life.
And living under this intense societal pressure, this constant scrutiny, the presumption of guilt, the threat of ruin takes a severe, measurable physical toll. This brings us to the health crisis currently facing men, which is often completely ignored.
The text introduces a composite story based on real data. The story of John. John is a 45-year-old construction worker, a primary provider for his family. He starts experiencing serious, persistent chest pain. But instead of going to the doctor, John ignores the pain for weeks.
Why? Why would he risk his life?
Because he fears ridicule from his coworkers if he shows weakness. Because he feels the crushing, unspoken societal expectation of absolute male stoicism. He is conditioned to believe his utility is his labor, and if he stops laboring to complain about pain, he's failing as a man.
So, what does this all mean? It's a profound, lethal paradox that Riker lays out brilliantly. Men are still expected by society and by women, as the dating data showed to be the traditional stoic providers. They are expected to never complain, to work the dangerous jobs, and to silently bear all the burdens.
Exactly, but the paradox is that the very moment they exhibit the traditional masculine traits required to fulfill that provider role, traits like aggression, assertiveness, unshakable confidence, and ruthless competitiveness, they are immediately punished, disciplined by HR, and labeled toxic by modern progressive standards.
He cites a major study by the American Psychological Association to back this up, right?
Yes. The APA study found that modern men face immense contradictory scrutiny and pressure. They are caught in a brutal double bind. They are publicly shamed by the culture for being traditionally masculine, but they're also penalized romantically and professionally if they show too much vulnerability or weakness.
They can't win.
The result of this inescapable trap is a demographic that is suffering in absolute terrifying silence. It leads directly to skyrocketing rates of severe anxiety, hidden depression, and ultimately a male suicide rate that completely dwarfs the female suicide rate.
I'd like you, our listener, to reflect on this reality for a moment. Think about the public health campaigns, the pink ribbons, the mental health awareness months you see in your daily life on television or at your workplace. How often are they tailored specifically to men's health, particularly men's mental health? How does the funding compare to campaigns focused on women? Does Riker's point about men suffering in silence, isolated by impossible societal expectations, resonate with what you see happening to the fathers, brothers, and sons in your own communities?
It is a critical, highly uncomfortable question.
Yeah.
And it leads us directly into the final section of our massive deep dive today, the pushback and the path forward. Because Riker doesn't end the book by just outlining a depressing litany of grievances and telling men to give up. He dedicates the final chapters to documenting a massive, growing male rebellion against these captured structures, and he offers specific, actionable solutions.
Let's start with the pushback in the media space. Riker points out that while the mainstream legacy media is entirely captured, men have simply bypassed them by building their own massive platforms.
He brings up a pivotal cultural moment. Cassie Jay's documentary, The Red Pill.
This is a fascinating story. Cassie Jay was a self-identified, award-winning feminist filmmaker.
Yes. She set out to make a documentary investigating the men's rights movement. Her initial stated goal was to expose them as a hateful, misogynistic hate group. But as she actually sat down and interviewed these men, her perspective shifted completely. She ended up making a documentary that humanized them, showing the very real, systemic issues men face in family courts, workplace fatalities, and lack of mental health support.
And Riker notes the intense, vicious backlash she received from mainstream feminist groups for doing this. Protests were organized to ban her film from theaters simply for presenting men's issues sympathetically.
But Riker argues that backlash proved the movement's point, and more importantly, the genie is now entirely out of the bottle. He points to the explosive, unprecedented rise of alternative media as undeniable proof that millions of men are starving for unfiltered, honest discussions about their realities.
He cites Joe Rogan here as the ultimate example.
The Joe Rogan Experience boasts over 200 million downloads a month. It dwarfs legacy media networks. Riker views Rogan's platform as a massive, vital sanctuary where men's issues, biology, and cultural shifts can be discussed openly for 3 hours at a time, without the host immediately demonizing the guests or cutting to a commercial break the moment a controversial truth is spoken.
He also mentions figures like the clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson and independent journalists like Tim Pool. These figures offer a refuge for men who are seeking rigorous intellectual analysis of these cultural shifts without the distorting lens of woke, progressive ideology telling them they are inherently evil.
Beyond media personalities, technology itself is playing a huge role in this pushback. Riker notes that men who often feel alienated by traditional female-dominated therapy environments are utilizing virtual reality therapy to treat severe anxiety and PTSD, finding innovative, tech-driven ways to bypass biased therapeutic settings.
They are also finding massive solidarity and brotherhood online. Riker specifically highlights the power of anonymous communities on Reddit, pointing to giant subreddits like Armin's Rights and Raskaman. In these digital spaces, millions of men can freely share their struggles with biased divorce courts, workplace discrimination, and loneliness, and finally realize they aren't isolated failures. They are part of a systemic pattern.
In terms of moving from digital complaints to active, real-world advocacy, Riker stresses the unparalleled power of storytelling. Data and statistics are vital for the foundation, but he points to the story of Matt. Matt was a devoted, primary caregiver father who unjustly lost custody of his children to an abusive mother simply because of the court's maternal bias. When Matt's heartbreaking story went viral online, complete with court documents, it did more to expose family court bias to the average voter than any dense academic paper ever could.
Riker highlights pioneers in this advocacy space, like Dr. Warren Farrell, who actually used to be on the board of the National Organization for Women before he wrote his groundbreaking, controversial book, The Myth of Male Power, which shifted the entire paradigm.
He also champions the hard, unglamorous work of building political coalitions. He points to organizations like the National Coalition for Men, which has effectively partnered with various fathers' rights groups to actually lobby state legislatures and successfully pass default shared parenting laws, changing the legal landscape state by state.
But he emphasizes one point regarding advocacy above all others. It must be strictly ethical. Riker warns that men cannot fight systemic hypocrisy with vitriol, anger, or misogyny. If they do, they just prove the mainstream media's caricature of them correct.
Exactly. He points to Jordan Peterson's incredibly calm, methodical, hyper-rational debate style as the gold standard for male advocacy. You have to argue with cold facts, unshakable integrity, and a refusal to be baited into emotional outbursts.
Or at the micro level, the personal level, what is the most powerful form of advocacy a man can engage in?
Riker argues it is embracing fatherhood, not just biologically, but actively and intentionally. He issues a clarion call for men to fiercely protect their role in the family, to actively read to their children every night, to work diligently to save for their college educations, and to be present, unmovable, stoic role models of masculine virtue. By doing so, they build a generational legacy that entirely counteracts and destroys the progressive narrative of the disposable, toxic, or unnecessary male.
This raises an important question regarding how men can navigate a world they fundamentally feel is inherently stacked against them at every institutional level.
And the ultimate answer, according to the final pages of the text, is not to retreat into the very same victimhood mentality that the book criticizes. The answer is to embrace extreme, unapologetic self-reliance, to unite in brotherhood with other men, to build parallel economies and media structures, and to unapologetically embrace natural, protective masculine instincts.
So what does this all mean for you? Ultimately, Conrad Riker is making a desperate, forceful plea for a return to biological common sense. He is demanding mutual respect based on reality, not ideology, and insisting on absolute, unyielding, equal accountability for both genders.
To briefly summarize the massive, complex journey of this text, the author takes us from the absolute bedrock of evolutionary biology and the tragedy of David Reimer, through the hard economic realities of the motherhood penalty and the wage gap. We navigated the intense cultural battlegrounds of media narratives, the Me Too movement, biased family courts, and ideologically captured universities. And he concludes with a powerful, organizing call to action for men to wake up, unite, reclaim the narrative of their own lives, and advocate ethically and relentlessly for their rights.
It is an overwhelming amount of information to take in, and it challenges almost every dominant cultural narrative of the last decade. Before we wrap up today's deep dive, we want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to chew on. Something that builds on Riker's text but pushes the implications a step further into the future.
Let's hear it.
If society is indeed an evolutionary ecosystem, exactly as Riker suggests with his lions and penguins, and if traditional distinct gender roles were not tools of oppression, but rather ancient necessary adaptations critical for human survival over millions of years, what is the ultimate evolutionary destination of a modern society that entirely deconstructs and abandons those roles?
That is the ultimate question.
Are we, through technology and progressive enlightenment, successfully evolving past the primitive constraints of our biology? Or by ignoring our hardwiring, are we blindly setting our entire civilization up for an inevitable, brutal, nature-driven correction? It's something to seriously explore and debate on your own.
It is a profound question that forces us to look past the immediate day-to-day political arguments on social media and seriously consider the long-term, centuries-long trajectory of our species.
Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly extensive, challenging deep dive today. As a final reminder, please make sure to like and subscribe to the deep dive right now so you don't miss our future explorations into the texts shaping our world. Be sure to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books today to purchase the highly provocative ebook we discussed, Accountability Gap: Why Women Aren't Held to the Same Standard by Conrad Riker. And finally, don't forget to follow the author, @Conrad Riker, on Substack for more of his ongoing insights and essays. Until next time, keep diving deep.